Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. I sat in a hard leather chair in a Richmond law office, staring at papers that made no sense. Numbers blurred in front of me, but one stood out with vicious clarity. 0. That was what remained in the checking account I had used for groceries, utilities, and the ordinary business of being a wife. $0. I heard myself ask how that could be possible, and even to my own ears I sounded distant, like I was speaking from the far end of a tunnel. We had savings. We had investment accounts. We had a house. Across from me, Calvin Morrison's attorney adjusted his glasses and repeated the same line he had been giving me for 20 minutes. My husband had liquidated the joint accounts before filing. The marital home, he said, was traceable to property Calvin had purchased before our wedding and later rolled into the house we lived in. The investment accounts were in Calvin's name. And the prenuptial agreement I had supposedly signed 15 years earlier waived nearly everything I would otherwise have been entitled to claim. I told him I had never signed any prenuptial agreement. My hands were gripping the chair arms so tightly they ached. He slid a copy across the polished desk anyway. My name was there at the bottom in black ink, close enough to mine to make my stomach turn, wrong enough to make my skin go cold. The last curve of the signature was too large. The pressure marks were not mine. I knew my own handwriting the way I knew my own face. I said it was forged. He did not even blink. He asked whether I had paid for a handwriting expert. He asked whether I had any proof stronger than outrage. He reminded me that Calvin's side had already filed the document in Henrico County Circuit Court, along with affidavits stating it had been executed before the wedding and notarized properly. Legal aid, I had learned the week before, could not take a contested asset case this complex. 2 private attorneys had both told me the same thing. Challenging a forged premarital agreement after a decree required money for a forensic document examiner, a tracing expert, and immediate motions I could not afford. The cruelty of it was not just that Calvin had cheated on me or left me. It was that he had spent years making me dependent, then used that dependence like a weapon. He had persuaded me to leave my teller job when his promotions started paying more. He had made himself the one who handled taxes, filings, renewals, mortgage paperwork, and every conversation with every professional who mattered. He had asked me to sign packets without reading them because he was in a hurry, because his meeting was starting, because it was only routine. He had set up our life so that by the time he decided to erase me, I was standing in a lawyer's office with no independent income, no separate savings, no active professional network, and no money for a fight. His attorney made sure I understood how trapped I was. The relocation payment Calvin was offering would cover the deposit and first month on a modest apartment. I had 30 days to leave. Spousal support had been waived in the forged agreement. Challenging any of it, he said, was my right. Winning without evidence was another matter. I asked where the money had gone. Not in a dramatic way. Not loudly. My voice was almost calm. That seemed to unsettle him more than tears would have. He said he was not authorized to discuss Calvin's private finances. Private, as if 15 years of marriage had been a clerical error and I was a stranger asking an improper question. I stood, because if I had remained seated another minute, I might have thrown something. At the door, I told him to give Calvin a message. I told him Calvin could keep every dollar he had hidden, every document he had falsified, every lie he had built his new life on. I told him I hoped it kept him warm. The lawyer's expression flickered when I mentioned Yvette. So Calvin had been careful, but not careful enough. I walked out before my knees gave way. I made it all the way to my old sedan in the parking garage. Then I shut the door, lowered my forehead to the steering wheel, and let 15 years collapse inside my chest. My phone buzzed while I was still sitting there trying not to scream. The number was unknown. Against my better judgment, I opened the message. A photograph loaded slowly, as if my humiliation required time to sharpen. Calvin stood beside Yvette outside a resort in Maui, both of them dressed in white, both of them smiling like villains in an advertisement. Her left hand was angled toward the camera, showing off a diamond ring so large it looked absurd. Beneath the photo was a single line. "Thank you for making this possible. We finally get to start our life." I stared at it until the words stopped looking like words. Then I blocked the number, deleted nothing, and sat back. The ring, the location, the timing, the deliberate phrasing, all of it was designed to do more than hurt me. It was meant to tell me I had financed my own replacement. That was the kind of betrayal Calvin preferred. Not impulsive. Not messy. Planned. Layered. Efficient. I drove without thinking and ended up at the park by the James River, where Calvin had proposed to me 16 years earlier. Back then he had been ambitious and open-faced, a man with cheap shoes and bright hopes and a way of speaking that made every promise sound permanent. I had met him at Regional Trust Bank, where I worked the teller line right out of community college. He came in with his first truly large commission check and talked to me so earnestly about building a better life that I forgot to mind the line behind him. He returned the next week to ask me to coffee, and by the end of that first date, I believed I had met a man who knew what it meant to fight for something. We married 8 months later in a small church in Richmond. We were not glamorous. We were not rich. But we were supposed to be solid. I had believed in that with the full foolish seriousness of a woman who thought love and loyalty were the same thing. The first years really were good. We rented a cramped apartment. I worked full-time. He studied for an evening Master of Business Administration program and chased promotions with a kind of hungry discipline I admired. When he got sick, I made soup. When I got the flu, he stayed up changing towels and making bad jokes until I laughed. When his big promotion came in our 5th year, I celebrated like it was mine too. That was when the foundation shifted, though I did not know it yet. He started traveling more. He began using words like leverage and positioning in ordinary conversation. He came home tired and impatient. He said my steady presence made his success possible, and I was stupidly proud of that. 2 years after his promotion, he sold a small townhouse he had bought before we married and used those proceeds, along with a relocation package and a bonus, to move us into the larger house where we spent the rest of our marriage. He handled every piece of paperwork. He said the title needed to stay structured through him for tax and tracing reasons. I trusted him. When he suggested I leave the bank, he did not frame it as sacrifice. He framed it as partnership. He said we did not need 2 incomes anymore. He said the household load was distracting him from bigger opportunities. He said I could finally write, paint, rest, take classes, become whoever I wanted to be while he handled the financial pressure. He made dependence sound like freedom. That was one of Calvin's gifts. He could take the thing that weakened you and present it as proof of how cherished you were. I quit. For a while I convinced myself it had been the right choice. I organized the house. I learned recipes. I kept everything running. Then his promises about my future quietly vanished. The novel stayed unwritten. The art supplies stayed boxed. I became useful instead of fulfilled, and little by little he taught me to confuse usefulness with love. Looking back, the signs had been there long before I found proof. Calvin stopped asking real questions. He answered messages in other rooms. He turned his phone face down. He became protective of documents that had once been left openly on the kitchen counter. He began speaking about our finances in summaries instead of specifics. If I asked for details, he kissed my forehead and told me not to worry. The first truly clear crack came 6 months before the divorce. He was in the shower. His phone lit up on the counter. I looked because I thought it might be a work message he needed urgently. What I saw was a line that split my life in two. I cannot wait for next weekend. Tell your wife you have that conference again. Love you. I opened the phone. He had never changed the passcode because he did not think I would ever become the kind of wife who checked. There were years of messages, hotel confirmations, flight receipts, private jokes, arguments about timing, discussions about money, and enough photographs to make me physically ill. When Calvin came out of the bathroom, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the phone in front of me. I had expected fear or shame, or at least the decency of panic. He gave me none of those things. He looked at the screen, looked at me, and told me he had been meaning to have this conversation. Then he said he wanted a divorce. He said he was in love with Yvette. He said he was moving out that weekend. I asked what about our accounts, our home, our life. He told me his lawyer would handle the details and said he would make sure I was taken care of. That sentence still makes my jaw tighten when I remember it. Taken care of. As if I were a dependent relative he had outgrown. As if he had not already made arrangements to take everything I would have needed to survive him. The last time I went back to the house to pack, I expected emptiness. Instead, I heard the front door open while I was in the bedroom folding clothes into boxes. A woman called out for Calvin, and I knew the voice before I saw the face. Yvette stood in my living room holding fabric samples and a measuring tape. She was beautiful in the polished, expensive way that announces itself before a person speaks. She looked surprised to find me there. Then the surprise settled into something colder. She said Calvin told her I had already moved out. I asked whether she had come to measure for new curtains. She said yes, with the embarrassed half-laugh of someone pretending her cruelty was merely awkward timing. Then she informed me, with astonishing composure, that these things happened. People fell in love, marriages ended, and I should not make the transition harder than it needed to be. When I asked whether Calvin had told her he had drained our joint accounts and hidden money before filing, she did not deny knowing he was ruthless. She only said his finances were not her concern. A minute later, she told me maybe he would not have looked elsewhere if I had not become so comfortable. That was the moment I stopped mistaking my grief for weakness. I did not slap her. I did not shout. I told her to get out of my house. She reminded me it would soon be hers. I told her it was mine for 3 more weeks, and that if she ever used my pain as home decor again, I would make sure she regretted it. She left with a look that said she still believed she had won. What stayed behind were her words, sharp enough to cut long after the door closed. Comfortable. Mediocre. Replaceable. I carried them with me into a studio apartment with a stained carpet, a bathroom sink that dripped all night, and windows that did not seal properly. Calvin's relocation money covered the deposit, first month, and a basic security payment. After that, I had $273, no current resume, and 30 days before pride became a luxury I could not afford. I worked wherever I could get hired. A discount grocery store took me for morning stocking shifts. A diner on Broad Street took me for evenings and weekends. For months, my life narrowed into receipts, sore feet, late buses, and calculations about how many eggs I could buy without overdrawing my account. I sold my wedding ring to a pawn shop and felt nothing except irritation at how little it was worth. I applied for office roles at the library because the free wireless internet there was all I had. My friend Tanya called almost daily and offered me her sofa, her guest room, her patience, her fury, anything I needed. I took none of it for longer than a night at a time because I had spent too many years being managed by a man who called it care. I wanted the rebuilding to be mine, even if it was ugly. The call from Patricia Collins came the same evening I left Calvin's lawyer's office. That part of my life never felt strange to me, only suspiciously well-timed. Patricia said she had been trying to locate me for several weeks regarding the estate of my uncle Raymond Tucker. Service attempts had gone to the marital address, then an old post office box, before someone finally reached my cell number through a tracing agent. Uncle Raymond had been my father's older brother, a distant figure from childhood birthday cards with crisp bills tucked inside. After I turned 18, even the cards stopped. I assumed he had forgotten me. Patricia asked me to come to her office the next morning. She would not discuss details on the phone, but she said the estate was substantial and time-sensitive. I almost laughed from sheer exhaustion. My husband had just left me with nothing, and now a lawyer was telling me a dead relative I barely remembered had left me something that mattered. Patricia's office overlooked downtown Richmond. She did not waste my time with false suspense. Raymond Tucker, she explained, had built his fortune quietly in banking and investments. He had never married and had no children. After my father died, Raymond retained her firm not only to handle his affairs, but to keep track of public developments in mine. He had been estranged from my father, not from me. He followed my life through public records, through the occasional update from people he paid to confirm my address or employment, and Patricia told me after a pause, through Regional Trust itself. Years earlier, when I worked there as a teller, Raymond had come into the branch twice. He recognized me by my mother's face and my name on the badge. He did not introduce himself because he said my father had poisoned that ground too thoroughly. But he watched. He asked questions. He left convinced I was competent, kind, and being underestimated. Then Patricia told me the part that changed the air in the room. Raymond had left me 65% of Regional Trust Bank. I remember holding the water glass Patricia pushed toward me and thinking that if I let go of it, it might prove I was awake. The bank was valued at a little over $60 million. My shares, together with liquid accounts Raymond kept outside the institution, put my inheritance above $40 million. I asked why a man who had remained mostly absent would do something that enormous. Patricia handed me a letter. In it, Raymond wrote that distance had not meant indifference. He had watched my father ruin every relationship he touched and had watched, from farther away than he should have, me build a respectable life on discipline rather than noise. He knew about my divorce because public filings were public, and he knew enough about men like Calvin to understand what such a filing often concealed. He wrote that money could not undo humiliation, but it could stop desperation from deciding my future. I cried in Patricia's office harder than I had cried in Calvin's. Cruelty had finally met something that looked like mercy. The transfer was not instant, which made the whole thing easier to believe. There were probate filings, board notifications, tax documents, trustee meetings, and weeks of paper before anything became real. During that time, I kept working the grocery store and the diner because fantasy did not pay current rent. At night, I read everything Patricia sent me about regional trust. I learned how Raymond's stake had been held through layered entities. I read annual reports, committee minutes, governance rules, and banking regulations until my eyes burned. When the ownership transition finally closed, Patricia introduced me to Charles Bennett, the chief executive officer, and to Angela Ruiz, the chief compliance officer. Charles had the polite wariness of a man preparing for an incompetent heir. Angela had the still, watchful manner of someone who lived inside rules and expected everyone else to respect them. By the end of our first meeting, Charles knew I would not be ornamental, and Angela knew I was smart enough not to ask for anything improper. I quit both jobs the week my funds cleared. I paid off the apartment lease, bought furniture I actually chose for myself, and moved into a bright place overlooking the river. None of that felt like revenge. It felt like oxygen. Revenge, I learned, required patience, not spending. I joined board meetings. I sat through risk briefings, branch reports, lending updates, and compliance presentations. I asked questions until the answers sharpened. Charles stopped speaking to me like a nervous guardian and started speaking to me like an owner. Angela walked me through privacy law, suspicious activity protocols, customer due diligence, and the careful walls that separated governance from gossip. I did not ask to search Calvin's name. I did not need to. I had already learned the most important lesson of my marriage. Stupid moves are usually emotional. Effective moves are documented. I hired my own divorce attorney, Denise Walker, with the first serious money I had ever controlled alone. Denise did not offer sympathy before strategy, which was exactly why I liked her. I gave her the forged prenuptial agreement, the timeline of Calvin's affair, the records I still had from our joint finances, and every text I had saved, including Yvette's engagement photo. Denise read in silence for nearly an hour. Then she said the thing Calvin had counted on no one saying. "This is not over." She explained that reopening property distribution for fraud was difficult, but not impossible, especially if we could show concealment of assets, fabricated signatures, false sworn statements, or notary problems. We hired a forensic document examiner. Denise subpoenaed notary records tied to the supposed date of the prenuptial agreement. She pulled Calvin's financial disclosures from the divorce and started tracing what institutions had appeared and what institutions had not. The first crack came when the notary's stamp on the agreement turned out to belong to a woman who had been at a licensing conference in Arlington on the date she supposedly witnessed my signature. The second crack came through the bank, and even then it did not come to me casually. Angela asked to meet with me and Denise together. Because I had disclosed the reopened divorce matter, the bank had screened for potential institutional conflicts once subpoenas started going out. One of the responsive accounts belonged to Calvin. Angela was careful. She did not hand me statements. She did not let me touch systems I had no business touching. She simply confirmed, in the presence of counsel, that Regional Trust held a private deposit account in Calvin's name opened 2 years earlier, with a lump sum funding event large enough to matter, and timed closely enough to the deterioration of my marriage to raise questions. I was not allowed to see more without process. Denise smiled for the first time that afternoon. Process, she said, was exactly what we had. Within days, the court authorized formal production. The account balance was over $730,000. Calvin had hidden it in the one bank I now controlled, and the irony would have been almost comic if the underlying facts had not been so filthy. The source funds traced back to liquidated joint investments, redirected bonuses, and a brokerage account he had sworn no longer existed. Worse, Denise's forensic accountant found that Calvin had started moving money before I ever discovered the affair. He had been planning his exit in stages, skimming from the life we shared and parking the proceeds where he thought I would never think to look. He paid for weekends with Yvette out of a separate credit line, reimbursed some of those expenses through his job as business travel, and kept the large account untouched as his real escape hatch. The man had not fallen in love and made reckless choices. He had designed a replacement life while I was making his dentist appointments and ironing his shirts for leadership conferences where he was likely sleeping with her. Denise advised patience. We filed an amended petition alleging extrinsic fraud, concealment of assets, forged execution of the prenuptial agreement, and materially false financial statements. The court set an evidentiary hearing several months out. In the meantime, Calvin attempted the move that finally collapsed his certainty. He ordered a large wire transfer from the hidden regional trust account to fund a property purchase in short pump. By then, the account was already under legal hold because the court had directed preservation of disputed assets pending the hearing. The bank did what banks do. It refused the transfer. Calvin called the relationship manager, then branch management, then someone in private banking. Eventually, his own attorney received the standard answer that funds subject to litigation hold were not available for release. He knew in that instant that someone had found him. He did not yet know how completely. He found out 40 minutes later when Denise's office served his counsel with the account production, the forensic report, and noticed that we intended to challenge every inch of the decree he had hidden behind. He called me that evening for the first time in months. I answered because I wanted to hear whether panic changed his voice. It did. He asked how I had done this. Not what was true. Not whether I was all right. How I had done this. I told him I had not done anything except survive long enough for his paperwork to catch up with him. He started talking faster. He claimed the account was his separate money, his commissions, his planning, his right. I asked whether his right included forging my name and lying under oath. He went quiet for just a second, then recovered into anger. He said Yvette had warned him I would turn vindictive if I ever got resources. I laughed, which upset him more than yelling would have. Then I told him something I had been saving. Regional Trust was no longer just a bank where he parked stolen security. It was my bank. Silence hit so hard on the line I could hear his breathing change. When he finally spoke, he sounded small. He asked to meet. Denise told me not to go alone, so the confrontation happened in her conference room 3 days later. Calvin arrived with his attorney and the same expensive watch he had worn in the Maui photograph. Yvette was not there. Calvin still looked good from a distance, which made the rot more irritating. He tried charm first. He said we did not need to destroy each other. He said the account would look different once context was explained. He said reopening everything would embarrass us both. Denise slid the document report across the table. The examiner concluded my signature on the prenuptial agreement had been simulated from prior genuine signatures found on mortgage and tax documents. Then she slid the notary certification issue. Then the account trace. Then a printout of Calvin's sworn divorce disclosure, stating that no other material deposit accounts existed in his name. Calvin's attorney stopped touching the documents halfway through. Calvin did not. He kept his palm flat on the table like a man holding down a lid he knew would blow open. He looked at me and said I was making a mistake. I had rehearsed anger for months, but what came out of me in that room was far cleaner than anger. I told him the mistake had been his. He had believed dependence meant blindness. He had believed isolation meant ignorance. He had believed that once he pushed me far enough down, I would stay there because climbing required skills he thought belonged only to him. I told him he had misjudged me, but more importantly, he had misjudged paper. Paper remembers dates. Paper remembers transfers. Paper remembers what men like him swear they never touched. He started to say my name the way he used to say it when he wanted softness from me. I cut him off. I said he had used my trust as collateral, my labor as infrastructure, and my silence as cover. That was over. Denise ended the meeting 5 minutes later. Calvin walked out no longer trying to look superior. He looked like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was an estimate, not a structure. Yvette's consequence started with fear and ended with exposure. 2 weeks after the failed transfer, she called me from another unknown number. This time her voice was stripped of the confidence she wore in my house with those curtain samples. Calvin had suddenly become cold, evasive, and furious. He had taken back the spare key to the rental house they were sharing, moved important files off his laptop, and told her any problems with the pending property purchase were her fault for pressuring him. She admitted she had found a folder in his office weeks earlier containing draft agreements, asset spreadsheets, and a checklist titled transition plan. My name was on it. So was hers. He had a sequence for leaving me and another sequence for protecting himself from her. Yvette wanted advice. I gave her exactly one piece. Get your own lawyer before he turns you into a witness against your own interests. She did, and that was when the full extent of her involvement became impossible to ignore. Her attorney approached Denise with an offer of cooperation in exchange for avoiding implication in any concealment after a certain date. Yvette produced messages Calvin sent her during the last year of my marriage, bragging that he had my signature on file for anything he needed. She produced a spreadsheet matching the hidden account balance to a future house, a wedding, and a reserve fund labeled Clean Exit. She produced the taunting texts, including the Maui message, and a chain in which Calvin laughed about me living on 1 month's rent while he prepared to start over with someone who understood value. Yvette had not forged documents herself, but she had known he was stripping me down financially. She had mocked me anyway. That knowledge cost her dearly. Calvin accused her of betrayal the moment her cooperation became known. His company, already looking into his expense reimbursements, pulled her into internal interviews too. The job consequences landed next. Calvin had built his hidden life with more than just divorce fraud. Denise's discovery requests turned up travel reimbursements for conferences that overlapped with vacations he took with Yvette, personal hotel charges buried in corporate statements, and a pattern of false business justifications that his employer's internal audit could not ignore once subpoenas started referencing them. He was terminated for dishonesty before our evidentiary hearing even began. Yvette, who had benefited from some of those trips and lied to human resources once when the affair first surfaced internally, lost the promotion she had expected and then her position altogether. The engagement ring disappeared into legal valuation because the payment trail led back to the hidden account. The woman who had texted me as if she were standing on a winner's platform ended up leaving a shared rental through the side entrance to avoid local reporters waiting by the front door after court filings became public. Her apology to me, when it finally came in person, was not enough to erase anything. It was, however, honest. That was more than Calvin ever managed. The evidentiary hearing took place 8 months after the day Calvin's lawyer first told me I had nothing. Time mattered. It kept the story from becoming fantasy. There were continuances, expert scheduling fights, document dumps, motions to seal, and several miserable weeks when I thought Calvin's legal team would drag everything until exhaustion did what fraud had started. But facts have a steadiness that performance cannot match forever. The handwriting expert testified. The notary licensing records came in. The forensic accountant traced the hidden account. Denise established that Calvin's sworn financial disclosures were materially false and that the prenuptial agreement had been inserted into the case as if it were genuine when multiple indicators said otherwise. Calvin tried to maintain control on the stand. He called the hidden account a planning reserve. He called the signature issue a misunderstanding. He called Yvette unreliable. Then Denise introduced his own messages. Planning reserve became Clean Exit. Misunderstanding became, I already had her signature on old forms. Unreliable became a witness with corroborating timestamps. I will never forget the way Calvin looked at me during a recess after the judge announced she was vacating the prior property distribution and ordering full supplemental discovery under sanctions. He asked whether humiliating him was enough yet. It was such a revealing question that I almost thanked him for it. Enough, to Calvin, had always been measured by what he could tolerate, not by what he had done. I told him I had not come there for humiliation. Humiliation was what he sent to me in Maui. What I came for was accuracy. I wanted the record corrected. I wanted every lie put back in the mouth that made it. I wanted every dollar hidden through deceit treated as what it was, stolen leverage. Then I said the one line that finally made him look away. I told him he had spent years trying to convince me I was lucky to be protected by him. Now he got to learn how exposed a man looks when the woman he underestimated can finally afford the truth. The settlement came 4 months later after his criminal exposure stopped being theoretical. The Commonwealth's attorney did not build an empire around my case, and that made the outcome more believable. There was no dramatic raid. There was a referral based on the forged filing and false sworn statements. Calvin eventually pleaded to reduced felony counts tied to forgery and perjury rather than risk a trial with the document evidence stacked against him. On the civil side, the court ordered redistribution of marital assets, attorney's fees, sanctions, and restoration of funds traced to the hidden account. I did not need the money by then, but I took every lawful dollar because leaving it behind would have turned accountability into theater. The larger house was sold. The proceeds were divided under the corrected order instead of the fiction he had built. The hidden account was broken apart under court supervision. The clean exit fund became an evidence trail, then a ledger entry, then a memory of how much effort one man had invested in believing he alone understood consequences. Calvin still tried, near the end, to turn collapse into nostalgia. He sent one email through counsel asking whether I would support a private resolution that minimized publicity for both of us. Another asked whether I would consider not opposing certain payment timelines because he was under strain. The worst came after sentencing, when he caught me outside the courthouse and said we had once loved each other and should not destroy what remained of that. I looked at him and realized love was the wrong word for what he wanted. He wanted access. He wanted softness to survive him again. I told him there was nothing left between us for him to use. Then I got in my car and left him standing on the courthouse steps with a folder in his hand and no one beside him. That image pleased me more than I expected. Not because he looked broken, because he finally looked ordinary. My own life did not turn into a fairy tale after that, which was another kind of relief. I worked hard at the bank and discovered I was good at it, not as a mascot owner, but as someone who understood operations, culture, and risk. Charles stopped retiring me from difficult conversations. Angela started inviting my perspective before I asked for it. Tanya remained the person who knew how to make me laugh when legal language had burned out whatever patience I had left. I saw Christopher, the professor I met through one of the bank's literacy programs, often enough to remember that tenderness could exist without strategy attached to it. But I did not end my story with romance, because romance had never been the missing piece. Control had been. Clarity had been. The right to sign my own name on documents that changed my life had been. Everything else was secondary. The final time I saw Yvette, she was leaving a deposition in a plain navy dress that made her look younger and less certain than I remembered. She stopped and told me she had once mistaken being chosen for being valued. I told her a lot of women make that mistake, but not all of them send photos from resorts to the wife whose marriage they are helping destroy. She accepted that without defending herself. I do not forgive her. I do not need to. Her consequence was not just losing Calvin or the job, or the ring or the easy future she thought she had stepped into. It was learning, publicly and permanently, that she had attached herself to a man who treated women like staging areas. She helped him do it. Then she discovered she was never special enough to be spared. Sometimes I think about the first afternoon after the divorce meeting, the one when I sat in my car with less than $300, shaking so hard I could barely turn the key. Calvin had believed that was the truest version of me. The frightened one. The dependent one. The one who would take 1 month's rent, disappear quietly, and let his version of events harden into fact. He was wrong. Not because I inherited money, though that saved me. He was wrong because I learned faster than he could adapt. I learned the shape of institutions, the pace of procedure, the value of evidence, and the difference between revenge that feels good for an hour and consequence that lasts on paper. He planned for my desperation. He never planned for my education. I keep one thing from the case in the locked drawer of my desk at Regional Trust. It is not the settlement order or the stock certificate or any bank record. It is a copy of the forged prenuptial agreement with the expert's notes on the margin, every false stroke marked in red. Sometimes I take it out to remind myself how close I came to disappearing inside someone else's lie. Then I put it back and return to work in the building my uncle trusted me to inherit and the business I proved I could lead. Calvin once told me, in the most arrogant days of his success, that the people who survive are the people who know how to plan ahead. He was right about that much. He planned his betrayal for years. I planned my answer for less than one. Mine worked. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.